Hello and welcome back to Rage Gaming and more Path of Exile 2. Today we're talking Delirium, which is an incredibly important activity in the endgame for a variety of reasons. With the basic resources you get from it, you can enhance every map to be dropping better rarity or greater pools of enemies, while farming out the splinters needed to run the Pinnacle Delirium encounter. Simulacrum is extremely valuable in itself, but if you have no plans to run it for whatever reason, those splinters are still something you can trade for great value. Not to mention, the distilled emotions you get from doing the Delirium events, those can be very valuable, especially if you get higher tier 1s to drop. Ultimately though, it'll lead into greater mob density for XP, drop potential, and the ability to modify maps in the ways you want. It feeds into everything you do, so let's cover everything you need to know about Delirium. Delirium as the main activity is quite simple to explain. It's the Delirious map mechanics and also Simulacrum that's a lot more complicated. But for Delirium, you just have to find it during your Atlas map as this symbol right here, letting you know that the area contains a Delirium mirror. Of course, you can also use specific tablets, precursor tablets, to put into the towers to force maps within range to contain those mirrors. But each time you enter one of these Delirium maps, you'll find a nightmare mirror near the start. And to activate the event, you just walk through the mirror. From here, a fog will spread out, and while you're in that, you'll be killing these unique nightmare monsters. This will progress the distilled emotion counter at the bottom left, and by killing these nightmare enemies, that fills up and increases the emotion count the most, though you can still increase it by killing normal enemies too. It is possible to kill like every enemy on the map, including the nightmare ones, and end with like 4 to 5 emotions per run, so you generally try to aim for that. But these distilled emotions serve multiple purposes, like I said, setting up waystones for better juicing. But they can also be used to allocate a notable from the passive skill tree straight onto an amulet, or be sold for solid currency if you get lucky with those drops. So there's a couple things to know about the event while you're doing it. For example, you can at any time press the stop button at the bottom right to end it early if that's your desire. You might do that because you've got enough distilled emotions right now, but there's not enough enemies on the map to actually generate another, so you just want to leave. But it's probably the case that most of the time you'll never press that. You'll also notice that occasionally a timer will pop up on the screen, which when that reaches 0, ends the encounter early. That's because when you walk through the mirror to begin it, that emanates out this fog. But that fog begins to fade from that starting point. So you want to keep moving forward with that fog, staying in the nightmare, and trying to avoid staying out the fog too long to end it early. Through that though, you'll find lots of these extra mirrors that when you go near, of course it sends out that little group of nightmare monsters to provide some more density. Just be wary that they run straight out at you and will push you, and that can lead to some situations in higher tier maps. Also, while you're clearing this, whether you're doing Delirium or in a Delirious Waystone, you may encounter the two mini-bosses, Kosis and Omniphobia. Omniphobia seems to be more of a melee rusher, probably the easier of the two, while Kosis has this beam attack that you'll definitely want to avoid, but it does leave him exposed while he's doing it. So, of course, you want to make sure you kill those mini-bosses for their drops and the extra essence it provides. You'll also notice when killing these nightmare enemies, you'll occasionally get Simulacrum splinters. Those are very important as a valuable resource for the Pinnacle challenge that we're going to talk about in a moment. Just be aware that these seem to drop only in red tier maps though, so Waystone tiers 11 and above. But that's most of Delirium, the basic version of the event. Let's now talk about making your Waystones and yourself delirious. Let's take this random tier 14 map here and go into the Delirium tab. Here we have the distilled emotions that you'll collect from doing Delirium and also Simulacrum. To engage with this system, you just pull out some distilled emotions and click on them. That brings up the instilling menu. Here you could put in an amulet and put in, I don't know, some random combo to get some sort of allocated skill. In my case, I've got Unbound Forces. So if I pull up the skill tree and write that in, it'll show me exactly where it is, and here you go. So I have this effect despite not actually pathing over to it, which is pretty nice. So obviously that's very potent for setting up a build, but of course you can also put in a waystone. And now depending on what you actually put in, the different kinds of distilled emotions provide a modifier for that waystone. So with the cheapest, most common one, Aya, you can increase the amount of magic monsters on the map. That's great because more density, more XP, more drops. And yeah, the more you put in, the more you increase that number. But with that, players become delirious. And that increases depending on the amount of distilled emotions you put in. So it's 21% for 3 Aya, but for 3 Gil, it goes up to 27% delirious. Let's use this random tier 8 and just show that. So 60% increased magic monsters, and then we have that delirious, and it upgrades and changes the waystone, and now it has new inherents. So we've given it that increased magic monsters, but also that delirious effect as shown in the waystone. Then taking a map, you can put this in here and that will have you be delirious within. Now, this is going to generate a kind of layer of delirium. It's going to generate that fog over the whole map. In there, you will encounter the nightmare monsters as you would with the proper event. The difference here is the drops, because you're not really farming distilled emotions while you're delirious, but you are increasing the mob density. You're giving yourself those perks depending on what you actually distilled into the waystone. So while you can't get more distilled emotions that way, it still allows for splinter drops, which is still very valuable. And since you're going to need 300 of those to actually do the Pinnacle event, you would like to be doing this as much as possible. So even though Delirium is an event and you might not always have it, you can always be delirious by using these emotions, so you're always kind of farming splinters and increasing your XP due to the better density. That's extra important because these splinters, they just don't drop enough in my opinion. Compare that to Breach and those splinters, they drop way more from the enemies in greater number, and even the hands that you stomp too. So farming Breach splinters, man, is so much easier than Delirium and Simulacrum splinters. So I do hope they buff that. You might be wondering, can you be delirious while also on a map with Delirium? Well, it seems like you can actually start it, but you can't also have that layer of Delirium and the fog at the same time. So I don't think it's actually worth doing on a Delirium map. In regards to the different types of distilled emotions then, there are up to 10 as you can see. We have ire, guilt, greed, paranoia, envy, disgust, and despair. And then you've got fear, suffering, and isolation, which are the last three that I don't have. Let me just grab some of all of them to show you what they actually do. So ire, the cheapest, increases magic monster count. Guilt, the next one up. This means you've got increased pack size, great for XP. Greed is pretty important. This increases the rarity of items found in the area. So for farming drops, this is something I would recommend running as much as you can. There's paranoia above that. So increased number of rare monsters, maybe one of the most valuable ones you can run just for general mapping, I would say. Then we've got envy. Increased amount of waystones found in the area. If you're trying to sustain like tier 15s or higher tier maps, this is a great thing to run. Disgust will give you increased precursor tablets. Those are really important. So if you're getting low on those, this could be a way to kind of guarantee it, or rather greatly increase the odds. For despair, we have increased stack size of the splinters you're farming. So if you're farming splinters, definitely worth considering. For the last three then, we have distilled fear. This gives rare monsters a chance to have an extra modifier. For suffering, this gives unique monsters an extra modifier. And isolation gives you a much greater actual percent on the amount of delirious that you get. I believe it's 50% per. You'll note that these go up in tier though, starting with ire, up to guilt, up to greed, up to paranoia, up to envy, and so on and so on. So isolation is a pretty expensive one. 1 per 500 exalted, or somewhere between 4 and 5 divines. So if you get an isolation, that's incredibly valuable. The one below that is about 1.5 divines suffering on nearly 200 exalts. Dropping again with fear the tier below that, so you can see how it falls off. This means the ones that are actually the cheapest, such as ire, means you can always kind of be running these. Let's say you only wanted 3 of these, you're going to be able to do that with just a couple exalts. So it's not crazy expensive to kind of sustain delirious state for this farming purpose. I also want to reference the fact that you can actually reforge the distilled emotions, which you might not have known. This means you could take 3 of one at the lower tier and then turn it into 1 at the tier above that. So if you're in a desperate state, this could be something to consider, though obviously it's expensive to do. But that brings us to the Simulacrum talk, which basically you've got 2 slots up here and say the tab for it. We have the splinters, which you'll need 300 of to create a Simulacrum, a single one. This is then placed like many Pinnacle things, right here in the realm gate, which is next to the home point on the Atlas tree. Put it in there and then you begin the event. This is a Pinnacle event though, so incredibly challenging, but incredibly rewarding. In here, you will have to face 15 total waves of mobs, as well as the occasional mini-boss or 2 at the same time. Those are the familiar 2 that we might encounter at times during Delirium and Delirious maps. Now each wave will give you a new RNG negative affix for the enemies, much like a waystone modifier. So wave 1 starts very reasonable, but wave 15 is so much harder by comparison. On the bright side, you do get rewards at the end of each and every wave, so if you do fail it before the final wave, at least you get rewards on the way. But you will need to beat the 15th and final wave for the best potential rewards and the 2 Atlas points for Delirium and beating the Pinnacle. One of the biggest threats is definitely chill and freeze and being surrounded. So being able to deal with freeze and how deadly that is You know, being very aware of the mobs when they get 40% more cold damage, that's a really nasty fix. Extreme mob clear to prevent that from happening is a good idea, but if you're willing to invest, at the top right of the tree, you can find nodes like Icebreaker, giving you additional freeze threshold and also reductions on the effect of chill as well. This will buffer chill and freeze greatly, could be worth considering. There are also anti-stun charms, as well as specifically freeze and frozen as another option. But I do think committing to being able to deal with one of the worst affixes in there is worth the loss of DPS, because if you're dead, right, you have 0 DPS. Josh, in his experience, can kill everything pretty damn quick, especially the bosses. They'll be evaporated. But in his couple of attempts, they ended due to the insane power of the basic enemies. So I want to impress upon you how overly strong the basic enemies are in this content. Being prepared for that is vital. There's quite a lot of discussion around those basic mobs in Simulacrum being overly strong and hopes for rebalance, but we'll see. As a couple tips, be aware that you can always press escape to use the pause feature whenever needed. That can give you time to consider the situation, what mobs are running you, what's about to happen, maybe what you need to do. But you can also use that to log out and back in to kind of reset if things are looking too dire in that moment as a little trick. Now, where does the value come from doing this? Well, a good amount of it will come from the regular distilled emotion drops throughout each wave and run. You'll be able to pile a lot of them up through these runs, and so you have high potential to get a lot of these motions to sell, or say the higher tier ones, which as we've seen are so valuable. These are going to be a consistent source of value from running Simulacrum, and should be a great way to fund your next splinter purchasing to run it again. We don't want to forget the fact that the Simulacrum splinters, or say a single Simulacrum, these are incredibly valuable. Right now, 300 splinters to turn into one Simulacrum is going to set you back around 250 exalted orbs, or roughly 2 divines. So with it being that expensive, you certainly want to be ready to run this confidently. There is massive value potential from unique items that can drop after the final wave, the 15th wave. These special uniques are for helmets, body armors, and flasks. And unfortunately, the helmets, body armor, they're not that valuable at all, but the flasks certainly are. Doing a quick search right now, these flasks are worth over 20 divines, somewhere in the ballpark of 25 on average at this time, but they do go higher. The price seems to be steadily going down as, you know, more and more people are reaching super endgame build status. So because the flask is so valuable as a potential drop, and since you're going to need about 1.5 to 2 divines per run if you're purchasing things to run the Simulacrum, you might want to be careful about enhancing the run to get more drops, since you might be adding more to the pool, and so the flask will be more and more, well, unlikely to drop. If you get a flask to drop at the end and then sell it for like between the 20 to 30 divines, that can fund, say, 10 to 15 more runs of Simulacrum right there. And if you get another flash drop during all of those, well then you're making big money. Not to mention the massive amount you'll get from distilled emotions and other drops, like, you know, high-end currency like other divines and even greater jeweler orbs. That potential's there too. On the topic of the Atlas skill tree, it's a bit rough compared to pretty much all of the other ones I was looking at. The rewards have potential, but they do make things significantly harder. Probably the most important one is this one, Would You Like to See My Face, which is essentially going to double the amount of splinter drops you get so that you can run the Simulacrums more often and sooner. But the obvious issue is it's going to make the Delirium events so much harder, so even that shouldn't be done without thought, right? But the thing is, if you're able to solo Simulacrum twice so you can even get this, I think you're probably fine with the build you have. Overall though, Delirium is extremely valuable for a variety of purposes, especially Simulacrum. The issue with Simulacrum is that compared to most Pinnacle content, it does seem extremely hard to do, due to the basic mobs rather than the bosses themselves, but also the slower way you gather the splinters to attempt the Pinnacle. Maybe we'll get a rebalance, maybe they'll lower the difficulty of the basic mobs, maybe they'll increase the splinter drops. We'll see, it all depends on how the devs feel. We'll see what comes then, but for now, I hope that covered what you needed to know about all things Delirium. If you have anything you'd like to add to this topic though, you can let us know in the comments. But for now, I've been Hollow, you've been you, thanks for watching.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.